We have a special program today. It's part of our Follin Speaker Series. The Follin Series is an endowed speaker series, endowed by the Follin family, and it allows us to bring in some very, very interesting people. And here's one many of you know already. This is Andrew Maraniss, who will be introduced by Miss Little. Okay.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning. I hope you all had a pleasant break, a restful break. And Mr. Maraniss is back to quiz you on, just teasing, on Strong Inside, our summer reading choice. It's the book about Perry Wallace. I know a lot of you have asked about the Perry Wallace author, and this is Mr. Maraniss. And I did have one question for him. You all read the Young Reader's version, which was how many pages? 200 something. Well, this one was a little longer, but this is the one that I read at first. And there was a beautiful poem at the end. And I wasn't sure if you wrote that or if that was Perry's.
No, I wrote that.
Okay, so good deal. And I love that poem, and it's beautiful. And Miss Margette pointed that out to me, but I would love to hear that read at some point today. Okay. So anyway, maybe we'll do that. Thanks. So Mr. Maraniss is going to be in classes today, and also he's going to be hanging out in the library right after chapel. So without further ado, Andrew Maraniss.
Okay. Thank you, Miss Little, and thanks all of you for reading the book. It's a really tremendous feeling as an author to know that there are students all over the country and close to home that are reading Perry Wallace's story. And I just had a chance to visit with a number of international students to think that the first book that they've read when they arrive in a new country is the story of Perry Wallace is incredibly meaningful to me. Miss Little mentioned that this is a week where you're talking about bullying, and I think that Perry Wallace's story is really enlightening. Look at different types of bullying, so I wanted to address that for a minute. And then I'd love to take your questions. Miss Little mentioned that we would have time for that, so I want to leave time for questions. So be thinking about some, and they don't have to be the most profound questions in the world. I'd just love to hear about your thoughts about Perry Wallace in the book, and then I'll also tell you a little bit about my new book, which comes out in less than a month on November 5th, and I'm really excited about that one as well. So I think that bullying, when you really think about it, it comes down to an abuse of power, and it's typically someone who's in a powerful position or assumes that they're in a powerful position and is feeling a sense of superiority over someone else, which in every instance is a false sense of superiority. If you think about what we read in our founding documents of this country, or what we read in the Bible or in other religious texts about this idea that we're all created equal, how can you have a sense of superiority over another person? And so the bullies are always wrong. Bullies always think they're right, but they're always wrong, right? And so I think that's one of the lessons of Perry Wallace's story, is that when he was surrounded by racism, the racists assumed that they were right and they were in control. But this lesson of the book is that they were mistaken, right? And so Perry Wallace experienced, I would say, proactive bullying, but also a type of bullying where he was experiencing this idea of bystanders. And I know you've talked about bystanders at this school. So one example of that, I think, is the scene where Perry's playing against the University of Mississippi. Right, his freshman year, a type of bullying occurs where he doesn't even get to play against the University of Mississippi, where Ole Miss cancels both of its games against Vanderbilt rather than play against a team that had an African-American player. Right? So in this instance, this false sense of superiority that we're not going to even deem to take the court against an African-American player was a form of bullying that was denying Perry and the Vanderbilt team an opportunity to play that they deserved. Right? And so then Perry's sophomore year is the first time that he's able to go down to Oxford. It's the first time that an African-American player is able to play against the University of Mississippi down there. And if you remember the scene in the book, he experiences a physical bullying where he's hit in the face by one of the Mississippi players. And he's bleeding, and he can't see out of one of his eyes. And the referees don't even call a foul. Don't even stop the game so the trainer can come out to help Perry. And as he walks across the court, he experiences another type of bullying by all of the surrounding people who may not have been the person that hit Perry, but they cheer the fact that he's been hurt and that he's bleeding. So they're participating again in this false sense of superiority over Perry Wallace. But the interesting thing that happens in the locker room at halftime, and this is what Perry said was the most difficult part of that episode, was that at halftime as he's sitting there on the training table with a bag of ice on his face, and there's a clock in the locker room, just like that clock up there, that's maybe ticking down to the start of the second half. As that gets close to 0, everybody else on his team, all the coaches, all the managers, all the student trainers, the players, they all run back on the court to get ready for the second half. And nobody stuck around with Perry. Nobody had a sense of empathy or putting themselves in Perry Wallace's shoes to imagine what's it going to be like for him to run back out onto this court where he's been physically abused in the first half, where the crowd has been harassing him with the worst names that you can imagine. Nobody put themselves in Perry's shoes. They left him in there alone. And he knew that he was going to have to walk back through that door out onto the court by himself and experience this hostility with nobody standing by his side, nobody being an ally to Perry Wallace in that situation. And so he said it was at that moment that he recognized what being a pioneer was really about, and it was doing something, it was a solitary experience. And so when Perry talked to me about what his days at Vanderbilt were like, he said, it's a really interesting way of looking at life. And he said, we can all treat each other in any of 3 ways. You can be treated well by other people, you can be treated poorly by other people, or you cannot be treated at all. And so I think a lot of times when we think about bullying, we think about that second way of being treated poorly by other people. And those are the easy bullying examples to think of, the words that hurt people or the physical abuse that hurts people. But Perry said the most difficult part of his experience at Vanderbilt was this idea of not being treated at all. And so I would say that when you have an opportunity to step up in a situation and you choose to be a bystander, you're also engaging in a type of bullying that maybe we don't talk about as much. And so then Perry said that was the hardest part. That's when he really needed somebody to step up. And so in the book, when I talked to Perry Wallace or to some of his other African-American classmates, they would talk about showing up for class and sitting in the front row and noticing that nobody else sat in that row with them and nobody else sat in the row behind them. Or show up for your chemistry class, you take a seat at a stool, and whoever sits on the stool next to you is supposed to be your lab partner for that day. You watch that door, and as all the students walk in, nobody chooses to sit next to you. Or there are the fraternities and sororities that would have these parties on the weekends, but you couldn't come, if you were different. And so in this school or in every aspect of our society, there are people that for whatever reason are considered different, maybe for their race or their religion or their sexuality or whatever it might be. Maybe they're just a new kid at the school. And there are other people in that environment that feel like, well, because they're part of the dominant group, that they are superior to that person. We know that's not the case. And so that would be my lesson on bullying, is to really think about it in those terms. If you really believe that all men are created equal, or that we're all created equal in the image of God, then how can you be a bully? Right? That's the way I try to think about that issue. My next book, very briefly, is called Games of Deception. It's another sports basketball history nonfiction book. It's about the first United States Olympic basketball team, which played at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. And so there you see an example of a culture that assumes superiority over another group, and probably the most horrific example of collective bullying that we've seen, right? And so I think if you can rid that desire to be a bully in your own self, then maybe that will help prevent it from happening in larger venues and larger culture. But this book is about the invention of basketball in Massachusetts by James Naismith at Springfield College in 1891. 45 years later, after he invents this brand new game. Imagine there was a world without basketball, and then one day there was a world with basketball. And 45 years later, it becomes an Olympic sport. The man who invented it, James Naismith, is able to see his invention become an Olympic sport, but it's in Nazi Germany. And so this book is about the invention and the growth of the game, about those Olympics themselves. It's called Games of Deception because Berlin was a giant facade that Hitler and the Nazis built to try to convince the world that everything was just fine there. And we know that wasn't true. Just 15 miles down the road, one of the first concentration camps had been opened at the time of the Olympics. And so again, that book comes out November 5th, and I'm super excited about that one also. And so we have just a couple more minutes. I would love to answer any questions you had or hear about your thoughts as you were reading Strong Inside. And I know that sometimes being the first kid to ask a question in a large group is difficult, but we had some great questions in the ELL class before I came in here, and would love to answer any other questions that students have, or adults in the back of the room. Yes, ma'am.
So was I understanding this right when I read this, that when Perry Wallace were able to slam dunk, that the officials removed that from, I don't know how to explain it, but was
Right.
it because they were able to do it and white people weren't able to do it? Was that the reason that they removed it?
Generally, yeah. So the slam dunk was outlawed in college basketball Perry's sophomore year in college. Adolph Rupp was probably the figure in college basketball at that time. He was the coach at the University of Kentucky, which had a great program. He was the head of the rules committee. He had been born in the 1800s. He was an old school guy. And in the 1960s, we were just talking about UCLA, the game of college basketball was changing. It had been desegregated across the country. And so there were players like Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was playing at UCLA and was 7 foot tall and was dunking all the time. It was kind of the transition, if you've ever watched old black and white films of basketball where they're just dribbling straight up and down and shooting set shots. It was a transition from that period to more of modern basketball. And the dunk was seen as a new element of the game that a lot of African American players, not only African American players, but a lot of African American players were excelling at. And so you had this old guard in college basketball that claimed it was not sort of within the spirit of the game to play this way. And it was thinly veiled racism to reduce the dominance of those players. And so Perry Wallace was one of those players that this was directed at, because in his freshman year at Vanderbilt, he dunked all over Kentucky's freshman basketball team. Rupp was embarrassed by that. He knows that Perry's going to play against Kentucky 2 times a year, at least for the next 3 years. And then so that offseason, before his first year on the varsity, he has the slam dunk outlawed in college basketball. The end to that story is that in Perry Wallace's last game as a senior is at home at Vanderbilt against Mississippi State. In the last minute of the game, while the dunk is still against the rules, Perry's last basket is a slam dunk. He just does it anyway. And he told me that that was his form of protest on his way out. And growing up in segregated Nashville, there had been segregation laws, but they were unjust laws, right, that people protested. And in college basketball, there had been this no dunk rule, but it was an unjust rule. And so he was going to protest that on his way out. And for some reason, the referee should have called a technical foul because it was against the rules, but they let it go. And so that was a moment of triumph for Perry in his last minute as a college basketball player. Yes, ma'am.
When you were in my class today, you talked some of interviews you had done with the people who were in his life, and some of those people were the bystanders. So you talk a lot about not being a bystander.
Mm-hmm.
What did you get out of those conversations with those people? What would be hard to say about not being a bystander?
Right. So I have 2 versions of the book. You all read the young adult version. In the adult version, which is 4 times longer, so you all lucked out. You got to read the much shorter version of the book. The first chapter is different, and it takes place in present day. So not when Perry was in college or high school or growing up. And it's one of his Vanderbilt teammates named Bob Warren. And Bob Warren was from rural Kentucky. He had grown up in the 1950s. In his county, he said there were no African American people. And so when he arrived at Vanderbilt, Perry was one of the first black friends that he ever had, his first black teammate. He ends up being a great basketball player himself, Bob Warren. He was drafted by the San Antonio Spurs. He played 10 years of pro basketball. And he said it was while he was playing professional basketball, when he had almost only African-American teammates, that he finally started to see the world through their eyes. And he began to understand racism in a different way than he had ever thought about it before. And he had this horrible sense that, oh my God, what must Perry have been going through back when we were teammates at Vanderbilt? And he hadn't done a single thing to help him. He had never put himself in Perry Wallace's shoes. And so one day, 30 years after he had last seen Perry, he happens to be in Washington, D.C. on a business trip. And this is while Perry is a professor at American University in D.C. And Bob decides, unannounced, that he's going to go to Perry's office at the university. And he surprises Perry, walks into his office, reaches out his arm, and he said, "Perry, please forgive me. There's so much more I could have done." And so I felt that was an important scene, because it really represented a feeling that a lot of Perry Wallace's white classmates had over the years, as it dawned on them that they had been bystanders in a situation where they should and could have been upstanders, right? And they hadn't done it, and they had been living with this sense of regret for decades. And so I think that's an important thing for young people to hear, so you don't have to live with a sense of regret for decades. You can choose today to be an upstander in these situations and to reach out to people who maybe are having a hard time or are treated differently for whatever reason. And I can tell you that it was a profound sense of a missed opportunity that these people had, not just Bob Warren, but when Perry and I would do events together, especially in Nashville, where there were a lot of alums from Vanderbilt in the crowd, they would be in line to have us sign their books after the event. And a lot of times they would be crying, or they would have bloodshot eyes. You could tell they had been crying. And they would approach Perry, and just like Bob Warren, they were asking for forgiveness, and it had been something that they missed, that they realized, and these people are like 70 years old, so they're thinking about their life in context, and that they had blown this opportunity to step up, and they were feeling terrible about it. So, I mean, I think that's something that I've tried to incorporate more into my life. Personally, it's not just to think what I think are the proper thoughts, but to actually act on them. You know, and so you might think, well, I'm not the type of person who would be a bully, but are you the type of person that steps up? And those are, I think, two separate things.
Could everyone please sit up? A lot of you have got your heads down. Let's pay attention. Thank you.
Any other questions?
A bit more. Just give it.
Okay.
You got 6 minutes.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Stand up.
How did I feel? Right. That's a good question. So the first time that I ever interviewed Perry Wallace, I didn't actually meet him. So the first time that I learned about him was when I was a sophomore student at Vanderbilt. And this was 1989. And he had graduated in 1970. So that's 19 years later. And he had never been invited back to campus to celebrate and honor him as the first African-American player at the university and in the entire SEC. And there's a whole story why that was. But because Perry was invited back, there was coverage in the media about him returning to campus for the first time. And so that's how I learned about him. I hadn't grown up here. I grew up in Washington, D.C. and in Austin, Texas, and so I didn't really know the history of Nashville or of Vanderbilt. But I read that article, and I was taking an African-American history class at Vandy, and so I asked my professor if I could write a paper about Perry Wallace, because I was really interested in sports and history, and I was taking this black history class. And so I was afraid that she was going to say no, that sports isn't a worthy subject at a university, it's not serious enough. But she said, sure, if that's what you're interested in, that's what you should do. And so I called Perry, and he was a professor living in Baltimore, Maryland, and I just called him out of the blue. And he's so nice. He spent 2 hours on the phone with me that very first night. And so I felt really special just to even, not meet him, but just to talk to him. You know, he was the type of person that was so accomplished. And I think these are the most special people that have earned some respect, but they make you feel special. And that's the way Perry made me feel. I felt like I was really lucky just to have that time on the phone with him. So that was '89. I didn't meet him in person until 2004 at the SEC basketball tournament in Atlanta. Every year at the tournament, each team picks a legend from their past to be honored, and Perry was the Vanderbilt legend that year. And I was just there as a fan, and I went up and introduced myself and told him I was the kid that had wrote that paper. And then 2 years later, I emailed him again and said, "Do you remember me? I'd like to write a book about you." And so then I really got to spend a lot of time with him when he said he was on board with the book. And so I would go up to D.C. to see him at his house, or he would come to Nashville, and we would spend like a whole day together. And I felt like I was in the presence of a great person. Not just the presence of a great basketball player, but a great human being. You know, he commanded that attention, and not in a boastful, egotistical way, but in a really understated, he was just a smart person, funny person, asked me questions about myself and my kids. Like, he was just an interesting person to be around, and he was very wise. So anything that's going on, like in current events, I could ask him about, and he had a way of putting that news or that story into context that you would think about and just realize, yeah, this man, he's right. Like, he's lived through things, and he's just a wise person. My kids, who are now in third grade and kindergarten, were littler then, obviously, and they thought about Perry as sort of this Santa Claus or tooth fairy type figure that, like, did he really exist or not? You know, like, our dad talks about him all the time, and we've seen pictures, but we've never seen him in real life. And so the first time Perry came to our house, it really was like Santa had just entered the house. They went nuts. They were running around in circles, yelling out his name, grabbing onto his leg and wouldn't let go. And Perry was very kind to them, but about 10 minutes into this like total pandemonium of these little kids screaming at the top of their lungs, he turned to me and he said, "Andrew, do you have any Advil?" You know, because they had given him this splitting headache from all their screaming. But if Perry were here, and I wish he were here, he died 2 years ago. And I had a chance to speak at a number of schools with him. And you would have felt a personal connection to him. Whether he was standing up here on the stage or you actually got to meet him. He had a great way with students. He was a teacher, you know, himself. That's what he did for a living. And that's what meant the most to him, was to have a chance to tell his story to young people. People would ask him all the time, "Are you glad that you did what you did? Are you glad you were a pioneer? Would you do it all over again?" And you sort of hope, after you've read his story, you know how difficult things were, that he would have this sense that he was proud, that he was glad he had done it, and that he would do it again. And he was proud of it, but his honest answer is he would not have done it again. Because he knows how painful it was, how difficult it was, how close he was to not making it. The second African-American player in the SEC, Henry Harris at Auburn, committed suicide. I mean, this was a really, really difficult thing to do mentally and physically. And so Perry said, why would I do that again? But he did say that if his life experience could benefit other people in the future, that's what made it worth it. And so having a chance to meet with you, he would have loved to have been here, to be here. And I like to think that he's proud that I'm here talking to you when he can't do it, and that you all read the book. And that's why it means so much to me that you all chose to read this book. I think he's a local hero from our area that has a lot to say to us. Unfortunately, what he went through in the 1960s is too relevant 50 years later. But I think it can be informative. And so I'm really proud, Ms. Little and the whole school here, that you chose to read this book. Thank you.